Daniel and Maria looked like the perfect couple to everyone who knew them, but behind the smiles and photographs was a story of control, jealousy, and a chilling crime that ended with Daniel showing no emotion after taking Maria's life. Daniel and Maria were the couple everyone noticed when they walked into a room. They looked so perfectly matched that people often joked they belonged in a magazine. Daniel had the kind of smile that drew people in, and Maria's warmth made her instantly likable. Together, they seemed unstoppable. Friends described them as a pair who always supported each other. They posted cheerful photos on social media, vacations by the beach, candlelit dinners, birthdays full of laughter. To anyone scrolling through their lives online, they seemed to be living a modern-day love story. But appearances, as they so often do, painted only part of the picture. At the beginning, Daniel was attentive in ways that felt romantic. He sent good morning messages, showed up with flowers, and told Maria he couldn't believe someone like her had chosen him. She was flattered, and in those early months, she didn't question the intensity. His devotion seemed like proof of love. Slowly, though, what felt like passion began to look more like possession. Daniel started asking little questions that at first sounded innocent. Who did she talk to at work? Why didn't she pick up the phone right away? Wasn't she spending a little too much time with friends instead of with him? Maria brushed these moments off. Every relationship has small arguments, she told herself. She didn't want to ruin what seemed to be something solid. But Daniel's need for constant reassurance only grew. When she laughed at a co-worker's joke, he asked about it later. When she took longer than usual to reply to a message, he pressed her for explanations. He never shouted or lost control in public. Instead, he presented himself as calm, devoted, even protective. That quiet intensity made it harder for Maria to see what was happening. She told herself that he cared too much, that maybe she was overthinking things. The people closest to her noticed subtle changes. Maria had always been social, the kind of person who filled her weekends with brunches, shopping trips, and long chats with friends. Over time, she began canceling plans more often, giving vague excuses about being tired or too busy. In truth, Daniel preferred her attention to himself. When she was home, he seemed relaxed. When she made plans without him, his mood soured. It was easier to give in than to deal with his questions. Despite these shifts, Maria still believed in their future. She told friends that Daniel could be intense, but he was also thoughtful, the kind of partner who remembered her favorite foods and checked on her when she had a bad day. She clung to those small acts of kindness, hoping they outweighed the unease she sometimes felt. That unease, however, was growing. It lingered in the background, whispering that something about his love didn't feel safe. Daniel's devotion had stopped being sweet. It was beginning to feel like a cage. On the surface, their story still looked flawless. But behind closed doors, the first shadows had already begun to creep in, and Maria had no idea how dark they would become. As Maria's career began to flourish, Daniel's jealousy turned into something heavier, something that clung to him day and night. At first, it was small remarks that seemed harmless. He would comment on her new colleagues, asking too many questions about who they were and why they seemed so interested in her work. Maria thought he was just being curious, but curiosity soon became suspicion. Every promotion, every recognition, every late night at the office fed into his growing insecurity. To Daniel, success didn't look like Maria reaching her goals, it looked like her drifting away from him. He had once been the center of her world, the person she turned to for encouragement and reassurance. Now, she had managers praising her efforts and co-workers inviting her to after-work gatherings. Daniel couldn't stand it. When Maria shared her achievements with excitement, he masked his bitterness with a thin smile, but inside, the resentment grew stronger. In his mind, she was slipping further out of reach, and the thought filled him with panic. Instead of celebrating her accomplishments, he began questioning them. He would imply that someone else at her office must be helping her too much, or worse, that her long hours meant she was finding comfort in someone else's company. These accusations weren't shouted, they were whispered, carefully placed, designed to linger in Maria's thoughts. He wanted her to doubt herself, to turn back toward him, to seek his approval over anyone else's. But Maria was proud of the work she was doing, and she pushed back, insisting that nothing inappropriate was happening. Daniel didn't believe her. He started looking for evidence where there was none. He checked her phone when she left it unattended, scrolled through her social media, and studied her photos for any detail that didn't make sense to him. If she posted a picture from a work dinner, he would examine every face in the background, wondering which one was the threat. If she didn't answer his call right away, he built entire stories in his head about where she was and who she might be with. Maria's world, once open and carefree, was shrinking under the weight of his suspicion. Her friends noticed changes in her conversations. She laughed less, worried more, and often defended Daniel when no one had accused him of anything. She told them he was under stress, that he loved her too much, that things would calm down once he adjusted to her new role. But privately, she felt drained. His constant questions left her feeling as though she was being watched even when he wasn't around. The home they shared, once a place of comfort, now felt like a stage where she had to constantly prove her loyalty. Daniel's jealousy wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, creeping, and relentless. It disguised itself as concern, but it was built on control. Maria still tried to believe in the relationship, telling herself it was only a rough patch, something they could work through. What she didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't simply jealous, he was consumed. His thoughts weren't about fixing things. They were about keeping her no matter the cost. The night that everything changed didn't arrive with warning. It looked like any other evening, ordinary and unremarkable, as if nothing sinister could ever unfold within the quiet of those walls. The neighbors noticed the lights on, the faint hum of a television, and nothing else. There were no shouts echoing through the hallways, no desperate cries for help, nothing that would make anyone suspect the storm brewing inside the apartment. But silence can hide the darkest moments, and in this silence, Daniel's thoughts reached their breaking point. By then, his mind had been circling the same doubts for weeks, feeding off every insecurity and fear he carried. He had convinced himself that Maria no longer loved him, that her late hours and distant look were proof of betrayal. Whether true or not no longer mattered, his jealousy had twisted into certainty. And certainty, when poisoned by obsession, can become dangerous. Inside that apartment, the air grew heavier as Daniel's emotions boiled beneath his expressionless exterior. Maria was tired, weighed down from work and from the constant tension in their relationship. She wanted space, a chance to breathe, but Daniel wanted control. His calm appearance masked the chaos raging in his head. He had replayed this moment in his imagination too many times, and now, instead of pulling back, he stepped into it. What followed wasn't loud or frantic. It was terrifyingly quiet. Neighbors didn't hear the scuffle they might have expected. There were no warning signs piercing the night air. The world outside that apartment carried on as usual, while inside, Maria's life was cut short by the man who claimed to love her more than anything else. For Daniel, it was the conclusion of weeks of obsession, the moment where he acted on all the suspicions and fears that had been eating away at him. When it was over, the silence returned, heavier than before. Daniel did not break down. He did not run. Instead, he sat in the living room, the television still playing faintly, as though nothing had happened. Hours passed like this. He didn't call for help, didn't try to explain, didn't show signs of panic. The emptiness on his face would later shock detectives who walked through the door, expecting to find someone frantic or distraught. Instead, they found a man sitting calmly, detached from the reality of what had just taken place. Forensic investigators would later describe the scene as chilling, not because of the evidence they uncovered, but because of the atmosphere. The apartment was eerily still, untouched except for the irreversible act that had occurred inside. Daniel's lack of reaction only deepened the horror. It was as though he had detached himself entirely from the gravity of what he had done. This was not the explosive act of a man who lost control in a fit of rage. It was the quiet culmination of jealousy and obsession that had been building step by step until it reached a point of no return. And when that point came, Daniel crossed it without hesitation, leaving behind a silence that said more than any words could. When detectives began their investigation, the first thing that struck them was Daniel's demeanor. Most people in the aftermath of such a devastating event display shock, fear, or frantic attempts to cover their actions. Daniel showed none of that. His face remained blank, his voice flat, his answers short and almost rehearsed. He didn't pace or fidget. He didn't ask about Maria or what would happen next. He simply sat there as if he were a bystander to his own crime. The officers present noted the lack of visible emotion, and it unsettled them more than anger or tears ever could. As the questioning continued, small details began to surface. Maria's phone was filled with messages hinting at her desire for independence, for space to breathe again. She had told close friends she was considering leaving Daniel, though she hadn't yet made the decision. These fragments painted a picture of a woman trying to reclaim control over her life while caught in the grip of someone and willing to let go. For investigators, this gave context to the unspoken tension that had filled the apartment in the weeks leading up to that night. But Daniel's calmness didn't waver. Even when presented with evidence of Maria's unhappiness, he remained detached. He admitted little, denied less, and seemed almost indifferent to the implications of what they were showing him. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with someone who had snapped in a moment of uncontrollable rage. This was someone who had allowed his jealousy to grow, unchecked, until it hardened into resolve. Digital records became a turning point in the case. Forensic teams uncovered deleted searches on Daniel's devices that revealed his state of mind. He had spent late nights reading about controlling partners, about women leaving relationships, and about crimes disturbingly similar to what had unfolded in his own home. The searches stretched back weeks, even months. It was clear he had been preparing himself, not for the possibility of losing Maria, but for ensuring she would never leave at all. The evidence was damning, but what unsettled investigators most was his lack of reaction to it. When confronted with these discoveries, Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't argue or try to explain. He simply sat there, eyes downcast, as though the information meant nothing. It was this absence of emotion that made the crime feel even colder. The officers couldn't shake the feeling that the man in front of them wasn't just guilty, he was hollow. As the case built strength, those who had known the couple struggled to reconcile the Daniel they thought they knew with the man sitting in custody. Friends remembered him as polite, quiet, and deeply in love with Maria, but the investigation revealed another side, one hidden behind his carefully maintained image. His obsession hadn't been an accident or a passing mood. It had been carefully cultivated, nourished by suspicion and control until it led to something irreversible. The calmness Daniel displayed wasn't confusion, it wasn't shock. It was the aftermath of a decision he had already made long before that night. And in that chilling realization, investigators found the true nature of his crime. The courtroom was packed on the day Daniel's trial began. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras flashing as friends and family of Maria gathered to hear the details of the case. For many of them, it was the first time they would see Daniel since that terrible night, and the image that greeted them was almost unbearable. He sat at the defense table motionless, his face expressionless, eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead of him. People expected tears, anger, or at least some sign of guilt. Instead, they saw nothing at all. The prosecution laid out a chilling timeline. They detailed Maria's growing success at work, her attempts to hold on to her independence, and Daniel's increasing control over her life. They showed the deleted messages that hinted at her desire to leave. They revealed the internet searches that described patterns of obsession and methods used by controlling partners. Every piece of evidence pointed toward planning rather than a spontaneous act of rage. The jury listened carefully, some leaning forward, visibly disturbed by the cold precision of the story being told. When the defense had their turn, they tried to paint Daniel as a man under immense emotional strain, someone who had simply broken down under the weight of his insecurities. They suggested he was overwhelmed, that he had lost himself in the chaos of jealousy, but their argument struggled against the evidence. The jury could see the careful preparation, the quiet hours spent researching, the methodical steps leading up to Maria's final night. This wasn't a sudden storm, it was a slow and deliberate unraveling. Witnesses took the stand, each offering their memories of the couple. Friends described Maria's light, her laughter, her growing unease in the final months. Others spoke of Daniel's controlling behavior, the way he always wanted to know where she was and who she was with. Piece by piece, the image of their relationship shifted from perfect love story to dangerous trap. What unsettled the room most, however, wasn't the testimony, it was Daniel's reaction to it. He remained still, barely moving, as though the words spoken about him belonged to someone else. When the verdict finally came, the tension in the room was unbearable. The jury foreman stood, hands trembling slightly as he read the word guilty. The sound echoed across the silent courtroom. Family members cried, clutching each other for strength, while reporters rushed to capture the moment. And yet Daniel, at the center of it all, did not move. He didn't lower his head, didn't cry, didn't even blink in surprise. His lack of response was almost more shocking than the verdict itself. For Maria's loved ones, the hardest part was not just losing her, but realizing the man she trusted most felt nothing after taking her life. The coldness he displayed in that courtroom stripped away any lingering illusions about who he truly was. He had once been seen as devoted, even loving, but in the end, his silence revealed the truth. He had chosen control over compassion, obsession over love, and emptiness over humanity.